Thanks very much. Right, that was two very different and very controversial speeches. I'm sure you will have lots of questions, I hope. There are two mics on either side of the auditorium. If we can start with some questions, if anyone wants to just get in front of the mic, and we'll take you through from there. Okay, you, sir.
Hello, my name is Peter Rocha. I'm from MacEwan University in Edmonton, Canada. You'll have to bear with me. Like many of you, I'm coming down with a cold, so I'll try not to cough into the mic. Very wonderful presentations, covered a lot of ground. There were two questions that I had. One was that both of you used the word sustainability. And one of the things that I'm noticing, at least at our institution and at others, is this co-opting of sustainability in a financial sense. We have to be financially sustainable. And in some ways, it's almost trying to plug into an environmental movement and yet capitalize it at the same time. So I'm wondering about your comments on that trend.
Okay.
The second, oh, sorry, do you want
go ahead.
to answer?
Well, do you want to take that first, sustainability, as a key conundrum?
Well,
John?
is this working? Yeah. There are a lot of people who use the word democracy to defend totalitarian regimes or dictatorships of various kinds. I mean, there's a contested vocabulary. There's certain terms that we can't give up. We can't give up the term democracy, no matter how often it's abused. And we can't give up the term sustainability, no matter how often that's abused. We have to define it ourselves through our practice, our theory and our practice, and make it meaningful, make it clear what it means. That we're not talking about financial sustainability, we're talking about ecological sustainability. And that's, you know, if there's any doubt, throw in the word ecological, and that'll make it very difficult for the financial interests to defend what they're doing.
Richard, have you got?
No, that was good. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, and your second part of your question?
The second question that I had relates to one of the plenary speakers from yesterday, and I'm sorry I can't remember his name, but talking about figures coming out of China and the fact that consumption rates are going down. And in terms of your presentations, I'm not an economist, but it seems that we can capture statistics for consumption, but not for conservation. So my thought was that if the Chinese are not consuming as much, then they're conserving. So how do we capture conservation or saving economically?
Well, consumption is one of those tricky words too, because it has two meanings. Economically, consumption means spending by consumers. So when you talk about consumption in an economic sense, you're not talking about investment. You're not talking about what capital is doing with its money when it invests. But when you talk about consumption in environmental terms, it includes everything that passes through the economy. So it includes consumption plus investment. So this can be very confusing. If you say, well, the consumption is low in China, yeah, but investment isn't. And they have rates of growth of 7 to 10%. So in environmental terms, they're consuming massively. It doesn't really matter in that sense, in environmental terms, that the actual consumption sector is low. I hope this isn't too confusing, but I think that this terminological difference is very important because it's used to confuse us all the time. It's manipulated. So we're always told that consumption is the problem in the environment, and in a sense it is, but it means environmental consumption. That is when we use throughput of materials and energy. But then it gives you the idea it's consumers that are the problem always, and that when capital invests, it's not a problem. And so if you save your money, then you're saving the environment. But if you put your money in a bank account, they use that, at least they're supposed to use that, to invest, which expands the economy, which actually destroys the environment faster. So this double use of the word consumption is very, very confusing, and you got to sort it out. Environmental consumption in China is not low. Economic consumption in China is relatively low for their economy because investment is about half the economy.
Yeah, and, you know, when they talk about,
Richard,
is this
just-
on?
Yeah.
The environmental communication guys trying to, yeah, they're talking about spending on consumer goods. That's, what they're talking about. And also when you hear about the accounting for these things, the environmental accounting's never been a part of this. You read books by, like Juliet Shore's book, Plenitude. You really have to think through just how much they get away with in terms of not looking at the environmental side of what they're consuming, or the environmental damage as a cost, or as a line item in the balance sheet of what their actual consumption is. So, John's right that it's not really part of the equation. It's usually they're just talking about what consumers are spending on goods.
Okay. You, sir, and then you.
Thank you. Johan Lidberg, Monash University, Melbourne. A few years ago, the UK Sustainability Commission, I think it was its end report, was named Prosperity Without Growth, I think. And I want to ask both of you, where is the convincing alternative to growth and the capitalistic system? I think if there was a convincing narrative, surely we would have, changed the system. So why can't we find one? And if we can find one, what would it be?
I'm sure you can answer that, gentlemen.
Yeah, that's a good question. Keep asking that question. And there are. Let's put it this way. This is a growth-obsessed political economy. Is there such a thing as a sufficiency-obsessed political economy? When is it enough? And I always pose this question, and it's kind of the cultural sustainability question. How much communication do we need? How much information do we need? How much of all the stuff that we do in the society with information, how important it is to sustain or to support democracy, health, education, all these things? Does it have to grow constantly, or is there a sufficient amount? So the question is, look where people have found, let's say, an economy of sufficiency to support a culture of sustainability, and that's where I would find these examples. But, let's say maybe I'm going to do that with the next book. John's probably already done it, so.
Well, it's a difficult question. Where is the convincing alternative to growth? I mean, we live in a system that's based on capital accumulation. It has to expand. And it has to expand exponentially, ad infinitum. And we know that's impossible. We know now, all the science tells us that just from an environmental standpoint, we're going to destroy the planet as a place of human habitation. And we're going to do it effectively, if what the science tells us on climate change, in the lifetimes of most of us here. Because the turning point, the point of irreversibility is in terms of climate change, 2 degrees Celsius is only a couple of decades away. It's only 28 years away, but it actually is going to come out faster than that. So you're asking for a convincing alternative. Bertolt Brecht once had a little story about fleeing from a burning house, and people are in this burning house, and they're asking to be told that if they flee the house, that they'll have a great life outside. That there'll be sun and grass and everything else. If they flee the house is burning down. At what point do we decide that we're going to save humanity and the earth? And I mean, we have 3% growth a year in productivity, and we've had that for centuries. How much stuff do we need to make, and what 90% of what 99.9% of what we produce is garbage in some form or other? I think you could argue. To what extent, when do we decide that we want to produce a more qualitative existence that's sustainable that will allow us to solve our problems. Yeah, there is no convincing alternative in existence. We have to create it. But there is, capitalism isn't an alternative unless you think that the destruction of the species is an alternative.
In some of my work, I'm interested in the notion of frugality and reinventing a notion of frugality as a creative model to sort of address that. And that has been done by filmmakers like Robert Flaherty and Man of Arran here in Ireland back in the 1930s for a very right-wing agenda, but how to reimagine that for an ecological agenda is something I'm particularly interested in. Another question?
Thank you. Bob Hackett from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Moving from the macro system level to our own association, I wonder, would you like to say more about the responsibilities of an association like ours in light of the economic and particularly the ecological crisis? Is it to green our own practices, as Rick mentioned? Is it to do more media research that is informed by an ecological perspective? Is it to intervene in policy processes? Is it to support movements for revolutionary transformation? All of the above, and or something else?
I think, Richard, it was part of your speech.
Yeah, let me not talk about the IAMCR. Let me talk about other organizations. From schools, from workplaces, from even the Producers Guild of America now has a green production guide that it gives to filmmakers to show them ways to cut down on their carbon emissions. All of these workplace organizational opportunities to practice what I'm calling environmental citizenship are just part-time. If you want to know how to turn everybody in this room into a full-time environmental citizen, I don't know the answer to that. But if you want to turn an organization into a place where you can establish routines where people can at least in part of their work life where they come and do their thing are becoming part-time environmental citizens, then that's pretty easy. And we've seen that from simple things like recycling to putting out the water distribution things here instead of the bottled water. That can happen in terms of greening conventions. There are guidebooks to conventions that can reduce their carbon footprint, and all this stuff has been done, and there are some best practices that can be studied. But there's no recipe to magically turn everybody into anything but a part-time environmental citizen at this point. Even my son in his school knows more about greening, his life than I did when I went to school. Even though I planted a tree on the first Earth Day, it didn't really stick the same way with him. I mean, he'll glare at anybody who litters now, and he's become a little bit of a moralist about the whole thing. And I think that's new, and maybe that's happening in education systems everywhere.
Okay, thanks, John. Okay, our next question.
Michael Reel from Royal Roads University in Canada. Professor Maxwell, I wonder if we shouldn't extend the greening the media argument to not just the technologies and their manufacture and disposal, but the content of what we promote with these technologies. And I'm thinking of things like the massive media mega events, sporting events, for example, the Olympics, the World Cup, motorsports, that have huge ecological footprints, that are the air transportation to get people to these, the construction of facilities and the priorities of budgeting and so on, all of which tend to be very carbon intensive and counterproductive to sustainability. Is this what you would see as consistent with your overall argument?
I certainly see it as we could put it on the agenda of the critical work that we need to do as media communications researchers. Maybe it's something you want to add to your work on the Super Bowl greening of Michael Reel. But yeah, definitely it's on the agenda for research. Look at these organizations, look at these events, and look at how these production companies are working. And again, like I said, a lot of these companies are going green. When you have Rupert Murdoch in 2007 in convening all of his employees through some global teleconference meeting where he tells them they're going to go carbon neutral by 2010. They didn't meet their goals, but shows on Fox like 24 became the first carbon neutral show. I mean, it's a fascist show, but it was carbon neutral. You know, I mean, you have these people who are, there's greenwashing, as it's called, you know, the corporate social responsibility business, but there are also some, again, part-time routines, greening the places where they work, studios and television offices and things like that. So, you know, they've opened themselves up to that question, and they've made themselves vulnerable by actually doing audits of their green efforts, even though they might be bogus or not trustworthy. By even doing an audit, it allows us to ask them how well they're doing. So go for it.
Okay, thank you. Next.
John, I've just got a question about power relations and protest. You talked about the monopolisation of capital, the financialisation of capital, the huge power of corporations and so on. How would you conceptualise the relationship between those processes and institutions on the one hand, and the nation state on the other? I mean, if we look at the United States, it's pretty clear that Wall Street has captured the state apparatus. Goldman Sachs alumni are dotted through the Federal Reserve. Financiers are the biggest wealthiest corporate lobbyists. In smaller nation states, governments are losing their capacity to tax and spend, especially with recent revelations about giant tax havens and so on. Do you think that state structures are recuperable for protest purposes, or do you think they're too locked in to the power relations associated with financialisation and monopoly capital?
John?
It's an interesting question because, I don't know, 10, 20 years ago, people wouldn't have seen it this way, but now it's understood that we no longer really have democracy in the United States. It's very widely understood that we now have a plutocracy. That's intellectuals understand that, but the populace understands it increasingly, and they understand that the financial power elite controls a very large part of the state, and that in a sense things are locked in. And of course you understand that in Ireland because of what the government did with the banks, and it's true that the power of corporations, the power of finance, it's all reflected in the neoliberal reorganization of the state. I actually think that neoliberalism is a product of monopoly finance capital and reflects this shift in capitalist power and a shift in the role of the state. The state's primary role now is as the lender of last resort. The primary role of the state now is to increasingly to bail out capital, or to be restructured in order to bail out capital, or to divert revenues towards the financial sector. This is increasingly the way things are going. So it is locked in, and but we know that governments can be upended, that they can fall, that there can actually be constitutional change. I mean, look what's happening in the rest of the world. The Brazilian state is threatened, the Turkish state is threatened. One country after another, the population is rising up as a power, and I think this is going to be increasingly the case. We're only seeing the beginnings because of this interrelated crisis. People's lives are being undermined. We're no longer within anything remotely like a rational system, and we're just going to see revolt after revolt, and the state is going to have to face the rise of a new power. But right now, almost every state in the capitalist world is inserted within the monopoly finance structure.
Okay, our probably last question.
I'm Christian Fuchs from the University of Westminster, and I was struck by the use of Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction in the conference title that John was also talking about. And I mean, my question is, how meaningful is it really that we refer now to Schumpeter and creative destruction? Because, I mean, he was using the long wave theory, and the question is, will a new wave now be created by this destruction of capitalism? Is there really a kind of new basic innovation emerging? And also Schumpeter was mistaken, because since the 70s there was no constant growth then resulting in a big crisis. Now it was much more fluctuating, and I think Marx more stressed the other way around, that there's not a creative destruction but the destructive character of capitalist accumulation, when he writes that capitalism is both destroying the soil and the worker, as you were both stressing somehow, and that capitalism is devalorizing itself in the crisis and is destroying labor by substituting it constantly by constant capital, which results in this antagonism between productive forces and relations of production. And should we understand this notion of creative destruction? Does it help us now in this situation of crisis? I would understand it differently, this notion of creative destruction. Marx somewhere wrote of a destruction of existing evils and illusions, and what he meant by it is the means for a communist revolution, and which would also be a creative form of destruction, but a creative form of the destruction of capitalism. And I think that's what we need, and how we should understand the notion of creative destruction. So is there any meaningful use of this term? What do you think?
Thanks very much. If I could ask John to make a very quick response to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are problems with the concept of creative destruction, which is being used in various ways. I was actually explaining how Schumpeter had used it, and the debate that it arose out of, which is quite complex. Of course, he tied it in with long wave theory, but he didn't have a simple Kondratiev theory. He actually had a 3-cycle system, and when the 3 cycles overlapped, that was his explanation for the Great Depression. But the point here is Schumpeter was saying something very useful. He is a conservative economist, and I subscribe more to Marxist views, but you learn from wherever you can in order to understand the conditions in which you live and the possibilities for change. And Schumpeter took from Marx the idea, I mean, the notion of creative destruction not only was his argument against monopoly and stagnation, in which he proved to be wrong because we have monopoly and stagnation now, and we're really caught in that kind of crisis. But he also had a useful way of talking about the creative destruction of capitalism. He talked about creative destruction as a process by which capitalism destroyed its own institutional framework, and it destroyed not simply, it wasn't so much it destroyed its economy, but for him it destroyed its broader sociological underpinnings, and which you could see as encompassing things like communication too. And he saw this as, this destruction was actually, could also be seen as a transformation, the creation of the conditions for another society. Well, maybe we need to ask those questions today. Are we actually witnessing the destruction of the institutional framework of our society and the possibilities, the potential for creation of an entirely different society with all the capacities we have and the things we know and the dangers that we're threatened with? I think that Schumpeter's approach is very useful in that respect. But to tell you the truth, the reason why I focused on Schumpeter was that his notion of creative destruction was in the title of the conference. I thought I ought to try and explain how this played a role in what we're doing here.
Okay, we've run out of time, so thank you very much. I hope you've got some good... So please enjoy your lunch, and I hope you have some ideas for greening the media for the future. Thank you. Bye.